So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Open Streets as a tool for recovery, our first of two preview webinars of the 6th annual Vision Zero Cities. We hope these conversations will sort of spark your creativity and imagination around safe, equitable streets in these next 2 weeks as we prepare for Vision Zero Cities, which is going to feature conversations about the sort of forefront of accessibility, design, technology, and the future of our streetscape, always keeping in mind that the core tenet of Vision Zero is that safe streets save lives. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Shabazz Stewart. Shabazz, go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Shabazz Stewart. I'm the founder and CEO of Uni. Our vision is to create a network of secure bike parking and scooter parking facilities across New York City, but also in other regions. I'm super thrilled to be here on behalf of TA today. TA, as many of you know, is New York City's leading bicycle and pedestrian advocacy organization with more than 20,000 members and really a reach that stretches on more broadly than that. Today, we're talking about open streets as a tool for recovery. Open streets, I think, traditionally has been looked at through the context of places like the 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica and the pedestrian plaza in Times Square. But since the start of COVID, open streets has taken on more of a public health connotation. And with that, has taken on some significance in the future of cities as both an economic development tool and an economic recovery tool, but also as a means to get people socially distanced from each other. So we've seen a number of examples here in New York with Vanderbilt and Brooklyn, 5th Avenue, Brooklyn, really becoming the focal point of small business recovery and community development, but also 34th Street in Queens and a few other places really becoming the focal point of just community spaces that are living, breathing, and dynamic. So there's a wide-ranging conversation here in New York and more nationally and actually internationally about what is the future of these spaces, are they sustainable, and what do they have to teach us about the 21st century city. So I'm very pleased to share with you 3 panelists who are all superstars in the space. The first is Kaya Kool. She's an urban designer and the founder of You Are the City. She holds a degree in architecture from the university in Carroll, Germany, and a master's degree in urban planning from Columbia University in the city of New York. Previously, she worked for the New York City Department of City Planning as an urban designer, where she was responsible for design guidance and development of public policy for several rezoning applications and city initiatives. Next up is Michael Carroll, as Deputy Managing Director of Philadelphia's Office of Transportation and Infrastructure, OTIS for short. Michael is a creative and nationally respected leader with more than 25 years of experience in transportation. In this role, Michael Carroll leads the OTIS staff in developing strategies and implementing policies to build a safe and equitable multimodal system across Philadelphia's diverse and vibrant neighborhoods. And we also are joined by Cindy Eggleton, who is the co-founder and CEO of Brilliant Detroit, a nonprofit that builds kids success families and neighborhoods where children from birth to the age of 8 have what they need to go to school, be healthy and stable. This is done by establishing operating homes in high-need neighborhoods that offer programming to children and to families. So I'm going to have each of the panelists share briefly, starting from the order of introduction, what they do and what their involvement is with open streets. Start with Kaya.
Thank you, Shabazz, for this introduction. So I want to open with, I grew up on a shared street where cars and us as children shared the road, and pet turtle races is only one of many activities that happened on the roadway itself. But one reason why I'm here, I think, is that in early March, together with 2 colleagues, we were sort of brainstorming how we can get off our seats at home and be more engaged. And we started an initiative called Design for 6 Feet, which was initially only an Instagram account. We were starting to collect visuals and images of what was happening around the world and started a conversation that way. of how people in other cities were using their public space for safe physical distancing and creating more opportunity to be outdoors. And that has since evolved into a number of projects, primarily actually outside of New York City, in Hudson, in the Hudson Valley, as well as Newburgh. We've engaged with these small cities to help them open their streets for recovery. In Hudson, it was primarily around businesses, and then in Newburgh, we initiated a design competition for play equipment to bring kids out into open space as rec centers and summer camps were closed, and we're now working with 3 local organizations to implement and build these play equipment. So those are just 2 examples of how really in recent months I got more and more involved into the issue of open streets. I also should say I'm half a block away from Vanderbilt Avenue, so I live with a very vibrant open street on a day-to-day basis.
Awesome. Okay. Michael?
Yeah, so yeah, I sort of should reflect on the breadth of things that come out of left field that I'm asked to do professionally, and kind of put it in the context of the topic today. I started my career as a transportation professional. I've worked as a traffic engineer, very much consider myself to be a transportation person, but in my current role, at least officially, I'm asked to look at all kinds of different infrastructure. And so, I work a lot with the water department, a lot of utilities sort of indirectly. Also, we do a lot of sustainability work in the office as well, and I coordinate with those folks. And we're the people who pick up your trash. So there's a sanitation division that's involved in our portfolio as well. And the common thread for a lot of that is that it all takes place in the right of way, between the curbs, at the sidewalks, and that's the field that we play in. And I feel fortunate that I do have the transportation background. So when issues do come up about how to allocate space in the right of way, I've got an understanding. There's a little bit of a kind of a formal dogma that you're asked to bring to that kind of problem as a traffic engineer. And I've got decades of wrestling with that and figuring out how to include community voices and be flexible with the way we manage the right of way, in addition to the engineering pieces. But for this work, it's brought to light a lot of other issues and, capacities that we've had to figure out how to stand up and coordinate, in addition to that kind of core transportation work. And, even if we look at the kinds of tensions that it has raised, it's important for us to understand that there's been a lot of focus on kind of creating COVID streets or COVID capable streets that help support businesses, small businesses. There's a lot of interest that preceded the realization we needed to do that in taking advantage of the opportunity with shutdowns where a lot of traffic has disappeared. And that's created opportunities for people to use their streets, especially neighborhood streets, in different ways. And sometimes, which is taking priority both in terms of a particular street, but also which is taking priority in terms of the focus of, an administration, different departments involved in spending people's time coordinating is something that we've had to sort through, and making sure that there's equity in both of those discussions. So there's some real challenges that have been involved, and we're doing our best to navigate those. But, for practical purposes, and I think Kalya's comments seem to echo this as well, there's been a real urgency around small businesses. And so the commercial capacity of a city has been really at the front of a lot of people's attentions. And there's a level of desperation that we've been able to kind of assuage a little bit, especially in working with restaurants. And a lot of my time day to day is focused on figuring out outdoor dining challenges, outdoor dining opportunities, and making sure those things are coordinated with the other pieces of transportation. So hopefully we can reflect on that a little bit more as we go through our presentations and Q&A today.
Awesome. And Cindy?
Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy from Brilliant Detroit, as was just laid out there. So I'm coming from it from a little bit of a different standpoint. We have hubs, which are really houses in the middle of neighborhoods across the city of Detroit. Right now, we serve in 12 neighborhoods. And as part of that, we're looking for innovative ways to really help create kid success neighborhoods, which means that kids and families are getting the programs, services, and quite frankly, fellowship during this time where it's difficult to get together as a whole. So we are working on right now, along with the city of Detroit, an open streets concept where our programming is in the street. They're closed off along with residents, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But what I can say is the response has been amazing. People are looking for things like this right in the middle of the neighborhood. So I'm delighted to be here with the rest of the panelists and look forward to talking further.
Okay, I'm super excited. I'm going to speak a little bit about just the order of things. It's been a tough couple of weeks for moderators of panels and debates in general. I hope you guys are easier than me than the president was on Chris Wallace, but just kidding. But generally speaking, look, I encourage the panelists to engage direct with each other. You know, I want this to be a conversation, not just a question and answer. I'm going to jump around and I'm going to try to be as invisible as possible and let it be you guys that really do most of the talking. So I want to dive right in. Look, what is the best open street in your opinion, and what are some best practices that we should all keep in mind as we move forward in 2021 for how to implement and develop open streets? And I will start with you, Michael. Michael, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I'm just managing the unmute. Yeah, so thank you. It's a good question. Like many questions, I don't think there's any one answer we could focus on. And I would just reflect on the fact that by their nature, streets are dynamic. So I would ask people not to kind of close their eyes and dream up kind of a picture or image of what that street looks like and say that's the best open street, because you have an opportunity with the street for whatever it is to change. And it's sort of the pace of the change of what's taking place, that programming like Cindy talks about, the institutional aspects, the social aspects of making those changes, of standing them up, of experiencing them and then transitioning them to something else. That's the environment. That's sort of like that process is as important as the outcomes, the individual outcomes. And streets in some people's minds are just for transportation, just for movement. Some people will take the perspective they're just for cars and other stuff doesn't belong in there. And so when you lock in on any vision about what's actually happening, I think you're missing an opportunity to think about how these spaces are inherently dynamic. And so the work that's involved is really thinking through that programming and setting up, so processes for that programming to be more social, more democratic, more responsive, more equitable. And, that can take the form of sort of cafe tables in the middle of a big arterial, for periods of time, or, it could take the form of protests being accommodated under COVID. It could take the form of, buses moving in places where they're too congested to move at different times of the day, the week, the month, the year. And so that's kind of my response to that.
Do you have a favorite open street, one that's a model, Pro Templar?
I think, we're probably looking at good examples if we take, I'll just say some of the smaller streets in our city, and working, more directly with them for things like outdoor dining. You can create a nice atmosphere for people to really spend a lot of time. Maybe I'm saying that because there's fewer headaches that go with making that work, and fewer complaints to come in the inbox. But we also have a kind of a district. It's 13th Street in Philadelphia, which is what we call Midtown Village, and another district called Old City, which is kind of near where a lot of the founding fathers and mothers of the country, you see a lot of historic sites around there. So we took a block or two or three of these places and have been doing an ongoing closure. So those closures have started out as sort of like just Saturday, Sunday, and then we added a Friday, and then we added a Thursday, and we're experimenting with a Wednesday, where they're just not open to traffic for 24 hours, you know, or 48, 36 hours at a time. And, you know, that allows for a semi-permanent setup. Again, it's focused on dining opportunities, but it's also just a nice place for people to kind of be. And we're trying to be as cautious as we can, because we don't want crowds there. We don't want a lot of gathering. We don't want a lot of attraction there, but we can see how maybe when things get a little bit safer, there is an opportunity to kind of extend this beyond the crisis of the pandemic and figure out how to get that same experience and maybe expand on that same experience in the context of just everyday life.
Everyone else?
I want to echo the idea of process that Michael mentioned. I think we're really in a moment where anything we're doing in the streets right now isn't necessarily vetted through a democratic process the way we usually think about public projects, but it's a great opportunity to see what's happening right now in the streets as sort of one giant community engagement process, and trying things out, but also listening to what works for who. And so I would also say there isn't maybe one perfect open street. It of course depends on what is the perfect thing for the users of that street. Is it businesses, or is it in a residential block, the families that need that outdoor space? So those are very different goals. And we have an opportunity this summer, including now into the fall, to sort of observe, to measure what works, and then to see how we can transform that into an actual process of transformation for maybe some more long-term changes.
Yeah, so I just want to echo two things and put those in a little bit further. One, Michael, I loved how you said that we all should think of them as dynamic. And two, I think the point about the user is very important. And for us, that's people. And I think the idea of being able to both get feedback and understand it, but to continuously make those spaces dynamic when people are involved, help create a sense of well-being and something that's interesting to move forward with as well.
Cindy, I want to start with you on a question about equity. Here in New York, there's been a growing conversation about who has access to open streets. Particularly, are we seeing open streets in white neighborhoods, and are we seeing open streets in neighborhoods of color? To what extent is that applicable, in the rest of the country? Is equity a problem in the open streets conversation? And if so, how do we fix it?
Yeah, so equity is a problem or an issue in every context, including this one, in my view. And I think that is one of the reasons in the neighborhoods we work in, which are almost entirely 99% people of color, the response from the communities has been amazing. When we have gone into those in the middle of the neighborhood, we've gotten 100% buy-in, which is hard for me to imagine, and what we have heard is people don't do these kinds of things in our neighborhoods. So I think equity is an issue and needs to keep being pushed at. And I think when you open up boundaries in all ways, there's both gratitude and the ability for more community building that wasn't there before. So we see that in a huge way. We almost can't keep up with the demand. We're starting in 3 neighborhoods right now, and every single one of the neighborhoods we're in wants this for the very reason that you're talking about. It's not usually in our more suburban white neighborhoods, but so it's welcomed.
Well, I'll jump in and I'll say it definitely is a challenge to balance those things. You know, and this is something I alluded to in my introductory comments, and it's that a lot of the focus, you know, coming at it from the perspective of city government has been on standing up these businesses and giving them opportunities to kind of continue being, you know, profitable undertakings, but also for, you know, let's call it selfish reasons of having to continue to pay taxes, right? So, you know, we're reflecting on the fact that it's a lot easier process to work with folks who have more capacity to work with you. And, you know, we're doing a lot of thinking about how to engage with others, how to provide some support for others. We were very fortunate to get a grant from the National Association of City Transportation Officials to help support some of that work. But, you know, in some senses, it's going to come across perhaps as a little bit of a drop in the bucket. And, you know, what we really need to reflect on, and maybe, you know, Cindy could add a little bit more detail and context to the work she's been doing, is how to engage more directly across a broader spectrum of folks on, you know, how to make use of the right of way. And we do have some models. Our Parks and Rec department has what we call Play Streets program that's been going on for, you know, at least a decade and probably much more than that, which is sort of doubling with kind of a nutrition program, which we stand up in the summertime to make sure that kids who depend on school-based nutrition have an opportunity when school's not in session. And that's programmed, and, you know, there's a high level of appreciation for that. But because, you know, that's been ongoing for some time, it's, you know, past the threshold for credibility in a lot of these neighbors where other branches of government coming in doesn't have that credibility. And what complicates that a little bit sometimes is a little bit of tension here in Philadelphia in some places around issues like gentrification, you know, sort of sense that reallocating space in the street is a precursor to displacement, you know, whether it's for things like bike lanes or pedestrianization of streets. And, you know, people who have kind of aspired to, you know, finally be able to get a car, use a car, and think that's kind of a standard of living that they want to embrace, sometimes feel like roadblocks to that are not things that they want to see in their neighborhoods. So sometimes when we show up and say, look, we want to do some reimagining the right of way, it's met with more resistance than we would like. So strategies to work through that would certainly be helpful, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, so if I can come behind you a little bit, Michael, because I think the work we're doing is actually in the middle of neighborhoods. So it's not even on a main thoroughfare per se. And we did spend time both doing focus groups and doing questions, but ongoing. We're launching what's called an imagination station. And it's not just a place to put ideas and thoughts in, but actually to do games for both kids and adults that they can lead and find what they might find interesting and also find in their own neighborhood. So it's actually building on the culture of the neighborhood and allowing them to make suggestions for what to add to the space or take out of the space. And I cannot emphasize how welcome this has been, and especially during COVID, when people feel kind of locked in their houses in a sense and don't feel that there's enough vibrancy in their neighborhood and connection. And we're able, because of the open streets, to do things safely. We're also using the spaces to provide more internet access because we've been able to get real broadband for the neighborhood and lend out computers for schoolwork, etc. And it's just been amazing how it's evolved. And I think will continue to evolve with the neighborhood voice being at the center of what we're doing.
I have a question for Kaya. And it's really a branch on the equity question. I'm curious to know, in your perspective, what, if any, city agencies should be leading the charge on developing and implementing open streets? Or conversely, is it better to see a more ground up method of development? And what are the implication models for both, particularly to be direct, if we have a ground up community driven process, are we going to see any disparities in communities that don't have that core competency or the bandwidth? And if we see governments take the lead, are we going to see bias disparities there? And how do we grapple with both of those? What's the balance there?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a perfect agency for this job. What comes to mind is the New York City Department of Transportation's Plaza program, which has essentially tried to work in partnership with communities to sort of foster this ground up version. And they've been very aware of the fact that that is biased because it requires capacity. And that was sort of my more general comment on the idea of equity. Equity also means that you have to have the capacity to bring programming to open streets or to install open streets, to even just maintain the barriers. I know from observation what I see here in Brooklyn happening, that in some neighborhoods, even now into the fall, these open streets are very well used by residents around the block, and the barriers are put up every morning, whereas in other neighborhoods, they've been broken for weeks and no one's there to replace them. And people that live there may simply not have the time, the capacity to invest in this, and who else does it then? We've seen that in Hudson too, where we worked, where equity was a strong goal. And yet at the same time, our limited capacity as sort of working pro bono with a number of other nonprofit organizations, we were really limited in what we were able to do. And sort of equity there then took on other forms, in that we were able to hire young people to maintain the infrastructure, to close off the street and teach them about public space. And we're hoping to sort of expand capacity in that way. But to come back to your question, I really do think it is sort of a joint effort of residents and city agencies, or nonprofit organizations in the American context, who can take on the role of providing capacity. And it sounds a little bit like that's what Cindy's organization is able to do. But then you really have to take a close look at how do you reach that capacity into the places that might need this infrastructure the most, but don't necessarily have themselves the opportunity to call for it, maintain it, and sort of program it and get organized.
Any other perspectives?
Well, I'll just echo the idea that there's no one city agency that can take all this stuff on. Yeah, you definitely need a coalition, and you need to get out of city government to do it effectively. We, like I said, we were able to take advantage of some partnerships that were reasonably straightforward to stand up with some external stakeholders. There's a good sort of fabric, let's put it that way, of business improvement districts, residential community organizations and so forth. And so that civic society, civil society, where it exists and where it's strong, really makes this work a lot easier. And where it's not so strong, I think, like Cindy's saying, there's a job to be done to stand it up and help it be more robust.
So I want to challenge the group on that. What do you do with enforcement? Enforcement, I think, in the transportation advocacy space is being re-examined, given the conversation we're having nationally over the past summer. So what do you do when someone won't move their car? And what do you do when someone breaks down a barrier? And an NGO or CBO may not be equipped to enforce. And what city agency fulfills that role, if any?
Well, I'll say time heals all wounds, both, preemptively and retroactively. So you just have to give yourself the time to communicate with people. And we encountered a little bit of that because we do street closures in order to support these activities, and they're more effective if somebody doesn't need to move their car midway through the event. And fortunately, in the locations we've worked, it's been a pretty well-known fact who you need to talk to, like whose car that is, and let them know what's going on and kind of have them come back. And, when that communication takes place and you have the time for a little bit of feedback, mistakes will happen, but people will understand and you can correct it. So don't try and rush, into these things so that you're not giving yourself the time to do that planning and do that outreach and engagement, and you're in a better situation. That's what I'm finding. And, these enforcement issues are a little bit different because the nature of the interaction of towing a car, unless somebody kind of sees their car getting towed, has a lower prospect for kind of spinning out of control than you might see from a traffic stop or something like that. But there is an exception, and we have some, not great experience around, for example, an issue that deals with groups of kids, young people on dirt bikes and ATVs doing ride-throughs in the downtown areas where in some cases they're coming across a street closure and kind of want to enter it and provide some level of entertainment, let's put it that way, for the people who are trying to have a meal, whatever. And the message fortunately has been clear, I think, for the responsible parties. We're not going to benefit anybody by escalating things or creating confrontations, but if we can work with stakeholders to try and engage calmly where it's helpful, be patient where engagement's not possible, we see with some patience these types of situations are dissipating. And not that it's not an issue, but we haven't had it become the kind of issue that escalates and gets out of hand. And I have a few anecdotes that I could add on all of that if anyone's interested.
Okay. Well, I want to ask another question about the purpose of streets and their role in our civic life as a city and the conversations that we have as citizens of a greater polity. So a lot of the protests this summer here in New York started in open streets and took advantage of open street space. What role do you see open streets playing in civic life, and how do we maximize their potential as avenues of civic engagement? And I'll start with Cindy, and I'm curious to hear the thoughts of everybody in the panel.
Yeah, so I think it's a big question. So we're in the middle of an experiment in Detroit. One of the things that's on my mind, even just listening to the other panelists, is just the importance of partnerships in doing these things, partnerships with the community, knowing the community in the neighborhood, but also partnership with groups that are non-traditional to work together. We're a CBO working with the city. That's unusual. There's about 5 departments engaged in what we're doing, but we know the neighborhood, and so that's been helpful. I see this as just a wide open space to consider, especially from an equity lens, of ways to have people come together and gather and provide both different needs. I saw in some of the threads here, food, but also just ways to promote and engage in reading and fun and being neighborhoods is sort of a non-traditional thought that you might have, not just related to businesses or a business community, but really related to what sometimes parks would do in the past that are not always doing that in some of our urban spaces. So again, I think it's a wide open conversation so far, and we're just a little bit into it. We've seen great both feedback and engagement, including we're trying to figure out how to do this during the winter time as well. So I just would encourage everybody who is on this call to think about different ways to do that and use it also as a way to gather ongoing feedback, not just on the street, but in general, what people need and want in their communities.
I want to respond a little more to this idea of, the streets as the civic space. And I, as an urban design educator, I used to say this even before we spend our entire summer walking down open streets and thinking about open streets, that I think the streets are in a way the most public of public spaces that we have in New York City and many other cities today. They're open to everybody 24/7. They're highly regulated, of course, through traffic regulations. And one reason why we're sitting here is that we think too much of that space is being taken up by cars. But they're also owned by the public 100%, right? Many public spaces, plazas, parks have a variety of different ownership or maintenance agreements underlying that come with rules and regulations that inhibit this idea that they're owned by everybody. And so I think this is something that we need to value. I think it is something where we need to question how that space that is owned by everybody and accessible to everybody 24/7 is used. But it's also something to keep in mind as we are thinking about these partnerships in a way, like how can we preserve this value that it is the most public of public spaces.
That's great. I really appreciate the responses, but I'm afraid I kind of lost track of what the original question is a little bit. So
We're talking about the relevance of open streets in civic life, protests, etc. I mean, the protests are a starting point. Of course, civic life is more holistic than just protests.
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge topic. So, all streets, whether they're open or not, and to the degree that they're open, I think we need to start thinking about that in very clear terms. And again, what I'll say is that, there's probably, anytime you bring this up, two sides to the story. And so managing the perspectives of people who really want to push against the idea that streets become more open, that there's more opportunities for people to come and be in these places is important. And, doing so in a way that doesn't really discount, what people have to say, but, looks for the both and opportunities and the ways to synthesize activities and the way to prioritize, at different times of the day and week, what's happening where and when. So there's a lot of, I think, best practice we have to build on. There's a lot of kind of technical base of knowledge that we need to build on. And I'm fortunate that, I'm involved with groups across the country like Transportation America that are trying to push, Transportation Alternative, that are trying to push the envelope on that. And so I'm hopeful that over time, these questions about the technique become clear, but I think they're really important and they're going to be central. And, it's not all engineering, sometimes I can bring a little bit of that bias to the discussion as well, but, the programming, how you successfully work with communities to understand the value of community programming, how you communicate that to people and generate feedback and dialogue about that, I think is important, because a lot of it is people's perceptions and fears and worries. Sometimes they're borne out in some ways, and sometimes they're not. And you're not always going to be able to predict that. But if you kind of lose your audience a little bit, you lose the constituents a little bit because they don't really feel like you've got a handle on the problem, or you're not hearing the problems, and you're not working in a deliberate and kind of thought out way. That's where I think a lot of the real issues come in, a lot of the strains come in. But we have to acknowledge there are some tensions, and we have to think about how to engage with those tensions and resolve them over time.
That's a good pivot point. I want to know how we measure what it is a successful open street. So, let's say in a year when we are looking back at how we figure out what's working, what's not working, what are key metrics that we can use that would tell us what is an unsuccessful street and what is a successful open street?
I'll keep talking if you'll allow me. The time scale of that question is really important. So, I'm at the other end of the complaint line, right? And, I get phone calls and emails, or people I work with get phone calls and emails, and you're going to get those anyway, regardless of how successful something is. Some of them will come in, but you start to get a feel for how many you got and how hostile they were, or whether there was some nuance and, on the one hand, the other, or next time you should think of, right? And so that immediate feedback is very important. You want to manage that immediate feedback in a way that allows you to come back and try it again and kind of learn your lessons and do better next time. But then you can also reflect on the time scale of, a decade and what you have to show for doing this type of thing, across a decade of experience. And I think if you look at some of the larger cities that have been doing things like this for 10 years or more, there's clearly some level of institutionalization that's taken place. It might be like the weekends in the summer. It might be it's this street every Friday. It can take a lot of different forms, but when you've achieved that institutionalization, that is success, right? That is definitely success. But it doesn't always work. And, depending on whether the text, the location, and the idea matched up well, you may end up with some scars to show for it. And, I'll reflect on the experience in the city of Philadelphia, but we essentially pedestrianized one of our major east-west corridors, created a transit way, and it ran for the better part of a decade, maybe poorly timed with a recession and sort of, decentralization of cities in the post-war history of America, but we had to reverse it. And, it left a mark on some of the people who were involved in that. People might look up the Chestnut Street Transitway in Philadelphia, and there's lots of ink got spilled on arguing why it failed and how it failed. But now you see stuff appearing in the newspaper, in editorials, on Twitter or social media. Let's bring it back. Let's try it again. And so how you measure success, I think, is that level of institutionalization, whether it sticks. Whether people maintain interest and enthusiasm for it, in my book. But, there's other measures as well.
I'd love to get Kaya and Cindy's perspective on this before we transition to some of the attendees' questions. So please, attendees, feel free to put questions in the chat, but, I'd love to leave the floor open for Cindy and Kaya to respond.
I want to add to what Michael was just saying, and my sense is that maybe a successful example is when Michael or whoever is responsible for that particular open street doesn't get any calls anymore because it's just simply, as he says, institutionalized. I want to caution that we tie it to some form of measure of having to count how many people use it. In my personal experience, some of the ones that I found more successful weren't necessarily the ones that were brimming with activity and were really vital, but that were just places where, I could feel safe stepping into the roadway. My child could feel safe trying to ride her bicycle in the middle of the road. And that would not be the case if it's crowded, especially not during current times where we all, we try to avoid crowds, right? So I want to caution that we find different ways of measuring success, not necessarily by how activated it is or how many people used it, but simply sort of maybe by the lack of friction among those users.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one little thing because I think both of you highlighted really great points. And I don't think it's an either or, it's successful or it's not successful. I do like the idea of once it becomes more institutionalized. I think the word I want to use is engagement, is that people are engaging in the space as they intended or it was intended, and that it creates that dynamic within that space. That's how I would kind of look at it. I find sometimes when you're able to be responsive, something that starts off as a complaint can end up being an innovation. And so, but I'm looking at it from a CBO perspective that is much different than having to handle it from a city perspective of things that can get out of control. So I think as local as you can make things, and to the points that were just made about, I want to feel safe, I want to be able to move around. That's not necessarily a lot of people, but people are engaging in how you intended it.
Okay. In the time that we have left, I'd like to just pivot a little bit to some questions from the attendees. I think Robert has a really common question that I get asked a lot in the space of advocacy, and I want to kind of, direct at you. And I guess we'll start with Cindy. What is the relationship, if any, between open streets and gentrification, and how do we, how do we wrestle with that, and how do we mitigate that if it's there?
So I definitely think there's a relationship. And so we're in a little bit different space because we are in the middle of different neighborhoods as opposed to it being wide open. And so I see all the time that there's a relationship. We're doing it in places that normally wouldn't have an open street, and also that are unlikely because of levels of income, etc., to become quite gentrified. We've chosen 3 neighborhoods for those very reasons. So I think for us, it doesn't really impact it. And I think from a city standpoint or from a policy standpoint, it's important at a macro level to make sure that as you're thinking about these things, you're looking at the types of areas you're going into and make sure you're hitting areas where the residents are highly engaged and can be engaged, and that it may not be those typical neighborhoods that would get gentrified.
I'm gonna play hopscotch here, just so we can get to all the questions. Kaya, as a follow-up, how do we design open streets so that everyone feels welcome? And maybe this is a little bit of a converse to gentrification. It's answering in a different way, but how do we make sure that this is a space for everyone? And what are some red flags that create an exclusionary space, that exclude people, conversely?
Ooh, it's a difficult question. I think because my sort of gut reaction to this would be, let's design as little as possible, at least for now, kind of echoing back to what I said earlier. I think we're in an experimentation phase. That less is more in ways to sort of see what works. But then it really depends on location more than design, I think. And in a way, I also feel like these sort of pretty simple NYPD barricades all around the city, blue wood, some really already run down and broken, are a pretty good signal for this. This is open and experimental, and we're not trying to design or invite a particular kind of population to these places. Given the nature of the pandemic in the summer, open streets have been by nature also extremely local anyways, right? So they are meant for the people that live around these streets. And that should be, in my view, the most important takeaway from this experiment this summer.
Gotcha. Michael, a question I think would be interesting for you. From your perspective, now that we have the proverbial foot in the door with the first generation of open streets, largely in response to COVID, both the economic fallout and the public health fallout, how do we use that to potentially push for more open streets? This question, I believe, comes from M.
Okay.
I'm sorry, not from M, from Jason. How do we use this as a groundwork to see this movement grow?
Well, I mean, COVID did not invent open streets. They pre-existed COVID, and it's worth looking back at pre-COVID strategies to do open streets in different ways. And so, I mean, some of that kind of looks like Cyclavia, which comes from Colombia. You know, New York City was a model for us in some ways with their summertime, you know, open streets kind of program. You know, we had our papal visit, which got us into what we called Philly free streets. And so that type of structure is something that we can still work with. What COVID did, I think, is it sort of broadened the base of awareness about, you know, how, you know, I'll put it this way, how pleasant it can be to occupy a street when you have no fear of traffic. And then for what purposes it seems to make sense and want to do that. And the city of Philadelphia has a pretty long-standing tradition, you know, program for what we call block parties. Sometimes it's great and sometimes it creates some headaches, but, you know, everybody kind of knows it's there. And, you know, kind of building up around the edges the existing opportunities that exist for people to close down a street and enjoy it, you know, at a neighborhood scale, but maybe even more than a neighborhood scale for one reason or another, and just kind of keeping, you know, your eye on more opportunities to do that and being a little bit less risk averse from the perspective of, let's say, the disruption to the ongoing pace of city life, because that ongoing pace has been disrupted in a way, you know, no one could have ever imagined. And so whatever we do, let's say next spring post-vaccine, is against that backdrop, you know, and not against the backdrop of, you know, kind of like the frenetic life of the city, or, you know, the big town, so to speak. So, you know, we were all afraid if we were asked a year ago, what would they say? You know what I mean? What would they say? What would they do if we shut XYZ street down? And you know what? XYZ street got shut down. It's just a reality, and we had to deal with it, and we dealt with it. And, you know, I won't make comments about the end of the world, but life goes on, let's put it that way, and we're figuring it out, and we can continue to figure out in more constructive and proactive ways, you know, having learned how to be reactive under the current circumstances. And, you know, there's an appetite to get back to more normal. And, you know, that's going to create issues because we'll have to collectively decide what that means, and people will bring different perspectives. But, you know, the default has shifted clearly.
Okay, thank you, Michael. We have one more question, maybe two more. One from Tim, which I think, Kaya, I think your background in city planning really allows us to think about this, but how do we convince city officials in this time of austerity to spend scarce resources on these open streets projects? And just pulling back, should open streets cost money at all?
Well, they haven't cost much money in this summer, or maybe I don't know, but I think we've been able to implement them really, you know, with trying to be as efficient as possible and as simple as possible. One thing I would say though is this is a matter of priorities, right? And I think generally in this, you know, sort of combining an answer to the previous question with this, is that we need to look at the future of this in the bigger picture, especially here in New York City. There are a lot of things about the future of the city that are unknown. I've lived in a 15-minute neighborhood for the past 8 months or so now, and that is something that a lot of people have been doing, and that will potentially direct how we think about issues of gentrification, how we think about issues of open streets and affordable housing. and more mixed-use neighborhoods where we can work as well as live and go to school. And so maybe there's a way to sort of more comprehensively think about shifting priorities or organizing our priorities around the way we live in whatever the future normal is, the future reality of cities. And so I think it is too narrow to think, oh, with no money, how can we possibly add this onto the city budget? There are other things that we have to consider and then figure out what our priorities are.
Okay. This is a short 1-minute question. We're running out of time. But what are the next steps moving into the winter? This is from M again. As traffic returns to normal. And this is for anyone who wants to take a shot at this in a minute.
Would you repeat that? I'm sorry.
As traffic returns to normal in the winter, what are the next steps for open streets? What's next? This is really a what's next question.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I don't think traffic is going to return to normal, but it will return. And so, you know, normal means that there's an AM rush hour and a PM rush hour and kind of a weekly pattern, and everything sort of has to dance around that because people have to get to work, right? And that's not coming back in the same way that existed, you know, in February of 2020. You know, it may come back 2 years from now or 3 years from now, but there's a lot of, you know, other decisions people will have to make about their businesses and where they live and, you know, how they want to work before that happens. And so the question is, as traffic starts to filter back, we need to understand a little bit better, you know, where are people going? You know, why are they driving around? You know, and what are they trying to accomplish? And how do those purposes, you know, stack up against the purposes we might want to allocate street space to in different ways? And there's not a great base of information. You know, the kind of survey work that built up over about 50 years to understand how people travel to get to and from work and for other daily patterns just doesn't exist yet. You know, we have better tools than we've ever had before, so we might learn very quickly, you know, what to do with that. But we're going to have to kind of feel it out a little bit, and we're gonna get beat up because we felt it out wrong one way, and we're going to get beat up a little because we, you know, went the other way too far as well. And I think realistically, over the course of about a year or so, we'll start to get a feel for it. And, you know, hopefully that feels a little bit more equity centered and a little bit more pedestrian and non-motorized and transit centered. And, you know, no one's going to be necessarily totally thrilled. You know, living in cities and, you know, urbanized areas is always going to present certain types.
Hey, Michael, I'm sorry, we got to jump in because
I'm sorry.
I'm getting the curtain pulled back on me. I want to thank all the panelists. Sydney has to leave us very soon. So Sydney and Kaya and Michael, thank you so much. And, you know, virtual applause from the attendees to you. And I'm going to hand it back to Nathan, who can take it from here.
Echoing Shabazz, thank you so much, Kaya, Michael. Thank you to all of our panelists and Shabazz as well. And I hope everyone will join us for our next preview webinar on the 15th at 2 p.m. This is a conversation with Vision Zero funders discussing the role of foundations in supporting partners who help fund, share best practices, and provide technical assistance. So again, thank you to all of our panelists and attendees, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.